So I want to kick off today with a pretty simple question. So don't think too hard about it, just go with your gut. I'd like you to raise your hand if you would loan me $1,000 right now. Got one, got two, a couple? Not too many. Okay. So for the rest of you who said no, don't worry, I completely understand. You made the right choice. Thing is, you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I want the money for. You don't know if I've paid my loans back in the past. The reality is, you can't trust me. And so when you look back over history, when we lived in small communities, we could trust everyone around us. Every transaction that we made was with someone that we knew. Trust was inherent in the transaction. But as communities grew to cities and global commerce expanded, this just wasn't possible anymore. At some point in time, we had to transact with someone that we just didn't know and couldn't trust. And this was the beginning of centralized trust providers. Things like governments and corporations that would sit at the center of these untrusted transactions to provide that trust. And this is the whole model that we built our entire society upon. Think of the number of banks, financial institutions, government operations that provide that role for us. And for the most part, that works pretty well, until it doesn't. And we've seen recently that often we can't actually trust the trust providers. You can just take a look at what's happening in Hong Kong right now to see that truth playing out. And when we can't trust our trust providers, the society that we've built up starts to break down. But I have some good news for you. We are on the cusp of a brand new era, an era where we can go back to transacting in a peer-to-peer fashion, but do it at a scale that's never been possible before. It's the era of decentralization. So today I'm going to talk to you all about how blockchain technology is what's making this decentralization possible. Are you guys excited? Yeah? Are you excited to finally understand blockchain? So let's kick it off by doing a bit of a level set and just make sure everybody's on the same page about what blockchain is and how it works. So does anyone here own cryptocurrency? Oh, my friends. Yes! Come talk to me after and I'll teach you all how. But the main thing to know about blockchains is it's just a word that describes an infrastructure level technology. Just some type of technology that you build other things on top of. Now, there are many different blockchains out there. Bitcoin is a blockchain, Ethereum is a blockchain, and they all have different properties, but at the core base level, a blockchain is just a ledger. It's just a record of transactions, that's it. So if you imagine if every financial transaction, every transaction of value that happens all over the world every day between people and stores and companies and governments and banks, if all those transactions were stored in one place, that's kind of like a blockchain. Now, these transactions are stored in little chunks called blocks, and the blocks are linked together in the format of a chain, hence the word blockchain. You can imagine that developers are not the most creative marketers. Now, what's cool is that each of those blocks is cryptographically linked to one another. And you can kind of think about that as though each block has a little Polaroid picture of the block before it that's coded right in. So if I wanted to hack one of those transactions, not only would I have to hack the block my transaction is stored in, I would have to hack every single block that came after it, because otherwise that Polaroid wouldn't match, which means that it gets harder and harder and harder to hack transactions the longer the chain gets. Now, there are three key properties about blockchains I want you to understand. The first, they're public to all users, which means if you had a private blockchain that was being used just, say, amongst a group of banks, every bank in that group could see every transaction. And if you have a public blockchain, like Bitcoin or Ethereum, every person in the world can see every transaction. So if you loan me $1,000, and then I said, oh no, I never got the money, I don't owe you anything, every person in this room could go and validate that that transaction had happened, and I couldn't hide behind my lies. Second property is that it's immutable, which means once you make a transaction, it can't be edited. So I couldn't go in and edit your transaction to say, actually, you only sent me $100, and I only owe you that amount of money. The third property is that it isn't centrally owned, which means that even if I knew the creator of a particular blockchain, I couldn't say, hey, listen, I owe this person $1,000 and I can't pay it back. Can you just shut the blockchain off so that no one can see that transaction? It's not possible. But if there's one property I want you to know and understand, it's that blockchains are decentralized, which means a copy of that chain is stored on thousands of computers all over the world. And so even if I were able to hack that transaction in that one block and every block that came after it, not only would I have to do it, but I would have to do it on at least half of all of those computers at exactly the same time, which makes a blockchain essentially unhackable. And subsequently, a blockchain is a single source of truth for every person on the planet, because we no longer need a centralized party to create trust when we can see the truth itself. Now, as I mentioned before, our entire society is structured upon these centralized players. So as we start to look at how we can rebuild the society we live in, that's going to be very, very disruptive. So to start to look at what that picture might be like, what a society without centralized intermediaries would be, we have to start at the very beginning. We have to start with the building blocks of community, which are people. And so I ask you, what makes a human a person? And the answer starts with a passport. My passport, actually. I was flying through Europe a couple weeks ago, and I had a stopover in London. And when I got to my gate to catch my last flight back to Toronto, I realized I didn't have my passport with me. It had fallen out either on the plane or somewhere in the airport, and I'm freaking out a little bit because I know that if I can't find it, I'm gonna miss my flight. I'm gonna have to get a hotel room in the city, go to the consulate, get an emergency passport, buy a last-minute ticket home. I figure it's gonna cost me about $2,000. And it gets me thinking, it's so ridiculous that my freedom as a human is restricted by a piece of paper that can fall out of my pocket. But the reason is that despite being a living, breathing human being, I am not a person in the eyes of the world unless the Canadian government grants me an identity, right? So in any transaction where my identity needs to be verified, the Canadian government sits as an intermediary. Now, I was lucky because I found my passport and I made my flight. Yes. But the worst case scenario was that I would have lost $2,000, which is at the end of the day, not that bad. But that's not the case for everyone. There are more than 65 million people in the world right now who are refugees or displaced people. Now, Canada took in about 25,000 a year, which is awesome, but is a drop in the bucket compared to the volume of people that actually need our help. And most of these people are living in deplorable conditions in refugee camps around the world. And they're not in these camps for days or weeks. They're there for months and years and even generations. And often they're stuck in these places for so long, not because they don't have places that will take them in, but because they don't have the identity documentation to prove who they are and where they came from. In fact, more than 70% of refugees lack the appropriate documentation. And more than 1 billion people around the world don't have access as well. But the key difference with refugees is that they also lack access to the third party that could grant it for them. They can't go back to their war-torn town to apply for a new ID at their local minister's office. It's not possible. And so as a result, these refugees and the 1 billion other people who don't have identity are shut out of some of the most critical services that they need, and some of them that they should have as basic human rights. Now, in order to fix that, we need blockchain. Blockchain enables individuals themselves to have sovereignty over their own identity. It enables you to be the owner of who you are. So let's look at this practically. A good friend of mine had a baby recently, and of course, she registered for a birth certificate with the government. And as she goes through life, she'll use that certificate to prove who she is and get a driver's license and apply for school and all these things. But imagine this. Imagine if instead of applying for identity with the government, her mom took a video of her baby in the hospital and posted it on blockchain and said, "This is my baby Millie. We're so thrilled that she's here. She was born on May 2nd, 2019. And then as that baby goes through life, more people will say, yep, this was baby Millie. I met her, I'm her grandma. Yep, this is baby Millie. She came through my kindergarten class when she was 5. Yep, here's the educational certificate, the degree that I granted Millie when she went through university. Here's the record of the $1,000 that Millie paid me back when I loaned it to her. And over her lifetime, she will build up an identity that is based on a lifetime's worth of truth and a lifetime's worth of trust. This is the possibility with blockchain technology. Now, the key thing that I want to talk about here is what's important is that no one can take that identity away from her. Do you remember the name Rahaf Mohammed? You may not remember her name, but I bet you remember her story. Rahaf was the Saudi Arabian woman who fled from her abusive family. She hopped on a plane, she left, they were on a vacation in Kuwait, and she flew to Thailand. And by the time she got to Thailand, the Saudi officials had contacted the Thai officials, and they confiscated her passport. Now, she was going to be deported, and so she barricaded herself in a hotel room until UNHCR would come and get her freedom and safety and asylum in Canada, where she lives now. Now, none of this would have been possible if she had had a self-sovereign identity, an identity that no one could turn off, that she could control, that she could open access to anyone at any point in time. Right? So for me, I would have lost $2,000 because I lost my passport. For Rahaf, she would have been deported back to Saudi Arabia and killed. Now, I want to go back to the story of our refugees and imagine their lives in a decentralized world. You run to a camp with nothing but the clothes on your back. Within minutes, you can prove who you are and where you came from using any internet-connected device. You get processed into a new country that much faster, meaning the impacts of living in a refugee camp are much less severe. Now you've got all your life savings and cryptocurrency, so you can use that to help you get set up. But more importantly, your identity is linked to all of your educational certificates, so you can prove that not only are you an engineer, but that you have a lifetime of experience to back that up, making your transition into your new life that much easier. It's incredible. And so for me, blockchain isn't about making a whole bunch of money on the latest boom and bust cycle of crypto. It's about enabling and empowering a world of people to validate their own truth. Thanks very much.